and now the floor is yours. For as long as you can keep it, so to speak. Well, I suppose 10 minutes is...
Sure. I apologize for events out of my control. I literally have 3 or 4 minutes to make 3 or 4 key points about where I see Europe at the moment. The first point is to build on the word deadlock. If you were to summarize the political science literature on European party politics at the moment, one of the key points is that the old left-right divide is increasingly making way for a new divide across Western Europe, but also Eastern Europe, which is often referred to as the cultural conflict axis between loosely termed liberals at one end and on the other nationalists. And that has been coming since the 1970s, 1980s. It's partly a backlash to the progressive revolts in the 60s and the 70s. But the consensus now, at least, certainly among scholars like Hans-Peter Creasy and Enrique Hernandez, is that that dividing line over immigration, refugee crisis, individualistic politics versus communitarian politics is now entrenched. And that can be seen partly in the vote for Brexit, but it can also be seen in the rise of populist right parties in countries that historically we were always told wouldn't have populist parties. When I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s, there was an unwritten law that you would never have a successful populist party in Germany, you would never have a successful populist party in Sweden, nor would you have one in Britain. And if you look at those 3 countries and the journey that they've been on over the last nearly 2 decades, some of those unwritten laws have been overturned. The second key point is that fragmentation in European politics is very much here to stay. And on the surface, that's reflected in Germany not able to find a new government, the historic delay in forming a coalition government in the Netherlands, wildly disparate coalitions that draw in very different ideological currents in countries like Portugal, and also politics in countries like Greece and what we'll see in Italy. And according to Creasy, at least, levels of volatility in Europe are as high as they have ever been since the arrival of mass democracy. And by volatility, what he means is the extent to which voters are switching from one party to the next. Even more volatile than the 1930s. One example is Britain, where we're now talking about the return of two-party politics because Labour and the Conservatives just won over 70% of the national vote. But if you take the 2015 election and the 2017 election in Britain, either side of that Brexit vote, more voters switched between political parties than at any other point in British political history. Labour went Conservative, UKIP went Conservative, Conservative went Labour, Liberal Democrat went Labour. And so we're seeing unprecedented change in the political loyalties within our system. But my third point is that alongside that fragmentation and volatility, we're also seeing groups of voters coming back into the political system that we haven't seen voting to this degree for quite a period of time. If you take the alternative for Germany, the number one source of votes for the AfD were non-voters, people who had not voted at the previous election. If you look at why the opinion polls were wrong in Britain, one reason is that around 2.5 million white working class voters turned out that the opinion pollsters said would not turn out. And those non-voters are further disrupting traditional political allegiances and mainstream party loyalties. Why are they coming back into the political system? A study in 2012 looked at non-voters across Europe and found that they were the most instinctively receptive to populism. They were distrustful towards mainstream parties, they were anxious over immigration, and they felt that the European Union wasn't listening to them. So I would suggest that populism in a way is interesting in terms of personalities and leaders, but it's more interesting in the way in which it is providing agency to groups of voters that historically have felt shut out of the political conversation. And the European Union has been, so far, very bad at communicating how those individuals can rejoin the national conversation. If you look at the two top issues in Europe today, in the Eurobarometer survey, which asks voters twice a year what they see what their key concerns are, the number one issue is immigration, and the number two issue is terrorism. We are now in a context in which identity politics is by far the dominant cluster of issues on the minds of voters. For Euroscepticism, that has opened up Euroscepticism to a much broader audience. The Brexit result partly reflected that. In the 90s, Euroscepticism was a fringe constitutional issue that animated backbench conservatives but wasn't really of interest to ordinary voters. Euroscepticism today, across Europe, is quickly merging with public anxiety over immigration, but also security. And that is opening up the Eurosceptic audience and giving them a much larger receptive audience than what you saw in the 80s and the 90s, when political scientists used to talk about something called the permissive consensus. And the permissive consensus was when voters were relaxed with their elites making decisions about European integration. Nobody talks about the permissive consensus anymore. What they talk about is what Peter Mayer talked about in his fantastic book, Ruling the Void, which is the hollowing out of liberal democracy. The way in which transnational institutions, in the eyes of the average voter, have become so remote, so detached, and so complex that most voters do not perceive themselves to have a stake in that conversation. So when I look ahead, and I am more pessimistic than most, so I think you've probably picked that up, but when I look ahead at the European landscape, I see elections in Hungary, which will see Viktor Orban easily win with 30 points lead or more. I see the election in Italy, which will underline fragmentation and volatility. I see the European Parliament elections in 2019, which will probably see record numbers of politicians from Eurosceptic parties entering into the European Parliament right at the time that the European Parliament is given more power. And I don't see much in the mainstream, and particularly social democracy, that is comprehending what is happening around them. In 2017, it was a catastrophic year for social democracy. German Social Democrats, their lowest share of the vote since 1933. Austrian Social Democrats, their lowest number of seats in history. Dutch Labour Party, their lowest number of seats in history. French Socialists wiped out. Macron won the election, but 46% of French voters in the first round voted for Eurosceptic candidates. So the volatility and the churn that I see under the surface of European politics, to answer the question that we were set at the top of this panel, is this an existential challenge or is it a passing phase? When you look at the evidence, you can only reach the conclusion that this challenge is certainly not a passing phase, but is actually here for the long term. And on that note, I need to head to the airport. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this. This was such an interesting intervention. We're very sorry that you have to leave, but we will read your books and articles, most certainly.